Long before the Stars and Stripes ever flew, before the first European ship touched these shores, this land was already ancient. It already had cities. It already had roads, trade routes stretching thousands of miles, and monuments that still rise from the earth today. Somewhere between 11 and 20,000 years ago, the first footsteps landed here, and by the time anyone from Europe arrived, this was not an empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. It was already home. It already had governments, religions, farmers, engineers, and astronomers. So who were they? Where did they come from? What did they build? And what happened to the world they created? This is the story of who lived on this land before America. When most people picture the land that would one day become the United States, they picture it as it looked in 1776, or maybe 1492, right before Columbus. But the truth is, human history on this continent stretches back far deeper than that single moment. For over 15,000 years, generation after generation lived, built, farmed, traded, and fought across this land. By the time European ships appeared on the horizon, this was not one culture, but hundreds, each with its own language, government, religion, art, and way of life. Some lived in small nomadic bands, following herds of bison across open plains. Others built cities with populations rivaling the great capitals of Europe. Some carved entire towns into sheer cliff faces. Others raised earthen mounds, so massive they're still visible from satellite images today. In this video, we're going to trace that story from the very beginning, how people first arrived here, the great civilizations they built across every region of the continent, how they governed themselves, what they believed, and finally, what happened when a new world arrived on their shores. The story begins during the last ice age, when much of the world's water was locked away in massive glaciers. Sea levels dropped low enough to expose a stretch of land connecting Siberia to Alaska, a land bridge scientists now call Beringia. For thousands of years, small groups of hunter-gatherers likely crossed this bridge, following herds of mammoths, bison, and other ice age animals into a continent that no human had ever seen. But the land bridge theory is only part of the picture. Archaeological sites like Monte Verde in Chile and the Meadowcroft rock shelter in Pennsylvania suggest people were already living deep in the Americas earlier than the old timeline allowed, which means at least some groups may have traveled along the coastline by boat, hugging the shore and moving south long before inland routes ever opened up. Either way, the timeline keeps getting pushed back. Some evidence now suggests human presence in North America as far back as 20,000 years ago, footprints preserved in ancient lakebeds in what is now New Mexico, left by people walking along the shore of a long-vanished lake. Whichever route they took, these first arrivals were remarkably adaptable. Within a few thousand years, their descendants had spread across the entire continent, from the icy tundras of the Arctic to the deserts of the Southwest, from dense eastern forests to the endless grass of the Great Plains, from the rugged Pacific coastline to the swamps of the Southeast. And as they spread, they didn't stay the same. Different environments demanded different solutions, and different peoples developed radically different technologies, economies, and cultures, setting the stage for one of the most diverse collections of civilizations the world has ever known. Let's start in the Southwest, in the high desert of what is now the Four Corners region, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. Around 2,000 years ago, communities here began experimenting with a new way of life. They adopted maize farming, likely learned from cultures further south in Mesoamerica, and slowly transformed from small mobile foraging bands into settled farming villages. Over centuries, those villages grew into something extraordinary. The ancestral Pueblones, sometimes still referred to by the older term Anasazi, began carving multi-story stone and adobe complexes directly into canyon walls and mesa tops. At Mesa Verde, entire cliffside neighborhoods were built into natural alcoves in the rock, homes stacked on top of homes, accessible only by climbing hand and toe holds carved into the stone. At Chaco Canyon, they went even further. Beginning around the year 850, they constructed massive structures called Great Houses. The largest, Pueblo Bonito, contained an estimated 800 rooms and rose as high as 5 stories, making it one of the largest buildings in North America until the 1800s. Alongside it stood another massive complex, Chetro Kettle, along with dozens of smaller great houses spread across the canyon. Chaco wasn't just architecture, it was the center of an entire network. Engineered roads, built with startling precision and often running dead straight for dozens of miles, radiated outward from the canyon, connecting outlying communities across hundreds of square miles of desert. Circular underground chambers called kivas served as spaces for ceremony and community gathering, some large enough to hold hundreds of people at once. And the great houses themselves were aligned with remarkable astronomical precision, capturing the light of the solstice sun, or tracking the 18-and-a-half-year cycle of the moon. This wasn't a primitive outpost. It was a ceremonial, political, and economic hub that pulled in turquoise, shells, copper bells, and even the feathers of scarlet macaws traded up from Mesoamerica, over 1,000 miles away. By the 1300s, prolonged drought and resource strain, including the depletion of the region's woodlands after centuries of construction and firewood use, pushed communities to leave Chaco and Mesa Verde behind, but they didn't disappear. Their descendants became the modern Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona, whose communities, including Taos Pueblo, have been continuously inhabited for over 1,000 years, making them among the oldest continuously occupied settlements in the entire United States. While the ancestral Puebloans were building in stone, a very different kind of civilization was rising in the fertile river valleys of the Midwest and Southeast, one built not from stone, but from earth itself. Near present-day St. Louis, along the Mississippi River, stood a city called Cahokia. At its peak, around the year 1100, Cahokia was home to tens of thousands of people, making it, at the time, larger than London. Its skyline wasn't made of stone towers, but of more than 100 massive earthen mounds, built basketload by basketload over generations. The largest, known today as Monk's Mound, covers more ground at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza and rises 10 stories into the air. Cahokia had planned neighborhoods, a massive central plaza used for games and public ceremonies, evidence of long-distance trade in copper, seashells from the Gulf of Mexico, and mica sheets from the Appalachian Mountains, and an astronomical monument researchers now call Woodhenge, a circle of enormous wooden posts precisely positioned to track the rising sun on the solstices and equinoxes. Cahokia was the heart of what archaeologists call the Mississippian culture, a broad network of mound-building societies that stretched across much of the Southeast and Midwest, from Oklahoma to Georgia, from Wisconsin to Louisiana. Related societies built their own mound centers, like Moundville in Alabama and Etowah in Georgia. Further south, along the lower Mississippi, the Natchez people maintained a rigid social hierarchy headed by a ruler known as the Great Sun, considered a direct descendant of the sun itself, whose authority extended over a highly structured caste system. Cahokia's decline, beginning in the 1200s and accelerating through the 1300s, remains one of the great mysteries of North American archaeology. Environmental strain, deforestation, flooding, social unrest, and possibly climate shifts tied to the same drought cycles affecting the Southwest all likely played a role. Eventually, the city was abandoned, its population dispersing up the Ohio River and into what is now Tennessee. But the influence of Mississippian culture, its art, its religious symbolism, its mound-building tradition, persisted in the societies that followed, including the ancestors of the Muskogee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw nations that European explorers would later encounter in the southeast. Now let's travel northeast, to the forests of what is now upstate New York. Sometime in the 15th century, some oral traditions place it even earlier, 5 nations came together to end generations of warfare between them. The Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca formed a political union known as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, often called the Iroquois Confederacy. A 6th nation, the Tuscarora, would join later. This wasn't a loose alliance. It was governed by an oral constitution known as the Great Law of Peace, which established a Grand Council, defined how disputes between member nations would be resolved, and set rules for choosing and, crucially, removing leaders. And in a detail that surprises most people today, political authority didn't rest solely with men. Clan mothers held the power to nominate the male chiefs who sat on the Grand Council, and if a chief failed in his duties, the clan mothers had the authority to remove him. It was a system of checks and balances, built centuries before similar ideas took hold in Europe. Some historians believe the structure of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy directly influenced Benjamin Franklin and other framers as they debated how to unite 13 separate colonies into a single nation. The Haudenosaunee were far from the only sophisticated political system on the continent. Along the Atlantic coast, the Powhatan Confederacy united roughly 30 Algonquian-speaking groups in what is now Virginia under a single paramount chief. Across the Great Lakes, extensive trade and diplomatic networks connected dozens of nations, moving copper from Lake Superior, furs, and finished goods across vast distances long before any European trading post existed. Travel further west, onto the endless grasslands of the Great Plains, and you'd find nations like the Lakota, Cheyenne, Comanche, and Pawnee, whose entire way of life revolved around the American bison. Before the reintroduction of the horse by Europeans transformed plains life in the 1600s and 1700s, hunting was done on foot, often using carefully coordinated drives that funneled herds toward cliffs or enclosures. The bison provided nearly everything: meat for food, hides for shelter and clothing, bones for tools, and sinew for thread. Plains societies developed highly mobile lifestyles built around the seasonal movement of the herds, along with rich oral traditions, sign language systems that allowed communication across dozens of different spoken languages, and elaborate ceremonial life, including the sun dance. Along the Pacific Northwest coast, an entirely different kind of society flourished, one built on abundance rather than scarcity. Nations like the Tlingit, Haida, and Kwakwaka'wakwa lived where salmon runs, cedar forests, and rich coastal waters provided so much food that permanent, densely populated villages were possible without farming at all. These societies carved massive cedar totem poles recording family histories and legends, built large plank houses, and held elaborate feasts known as potlatches, ceremonies where wealthy hosts redistributed enormous quantities of goods to guests, reinforcing social status not through hoarding wealth, but through giving it away. Further north in the Arctic, the Inuit and other Arctic peoples developed extraordinary technologies suited to one of the harshest environments on Earth: kayaks and umiaks for hunting whales and seals, sophisticated cold-weather clothing sewn from animal skins, and deep, precise knowledge of ice conditions and animal migration passed down through generations. And in California, one of the most linguistically diverse regions on the entire planet, dozens of small nations thrived on acorns, fish, and small game, developing intricate basket-weaving traditions so fine that some baskets could hold water. By the late 1400s, scholars estimate that somewhere between several million and 18 million people were living across North America alone, organized into an almost unimaginable diversity of languages, governments, economies, and belief systems. Estimates for the wider Americas run far higher still. This wasn't an empty land. It was a populated one, and it had been in constant motion for thousands of years, with empires rising, nations migrating, and trade networks connecting communities from coast to coast, long before anyone in Europe knew this continent existed. It's worth pausing here to correct a myth that still lingers in a lot of history books: the idea of this land as a frozen postcard, unchanged for thousands of years until Europeans arrived and started the clock. Nothing could be further from the truth. This continent was constantly shifting, long before any European ever set foot here. Recent archaeological research using radiocarbon dating shows that indigenous populations across North America rose and fell in waves for centuries. A peak around the year 1150, followed by decline then partial recovery, driven by factors like prolonged drought, disease outbreaks within large settlements, and shifting patterns of trade, migration, and warfare. Cahokia itself, as we've seen, was abandoned in the 1300s, its people dispersing and merging with other communities. Chaco Canyon emptied out around the same era. Entire regional networks that had existed for centuries reorganized, moved, or disappeared, only for new centers of power to rise elsewhere. Migration never stopped either. The ancestors of the Navajo and Apache, for example, are believed to have migrated south from what is now Western Canada and Alaska over the course of centuries, eventually settling in the southwest and encountering the Pueblo peoples who were already there, leading to centuries of exchange, conflict, and eventually intermarriage between the two very different cultures. Trade goods moved constantly too. Copper mined near Lake Superior has been found in burial sites 1,000 miles away. Seashells from the Gulf Coast turn up in the Midwest. Obsidian from the Rocky Mountains was traded as far as the Atlantic seaboard. In other words, before America was never one static moment frozen in time. It was thousands of years of layered history, nations rising, falling, merging, and moving, in a continent every bit as dynamic, complicated, and interconnected as the one on the other side of the ocean. Then in 1492, everything changed. Christopher Columbus made landfall in the Caribbean, and within decades, European ships were arriving along the coasts of what would become the United States. What followed was not a single event, but a catastrophe that unfolded over generations. The most devastating force wasn't a musket or a sword, it was disease. Smallpox, measles, and influenza swept through indigenous communities that had no prior exposure and therefore no immunity. In many regions, these diseases spread even faster than the Europeans themselves, racing ahead along existing trade routes and wiping out communities that had never even seen a European face to face. Within a century of first contact, historians estimate that somewhere around 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas had died. Entire nations vanished. Whole political and cultural systems collapsed before they were ever fully recorded by outsiders. Layered on top of disease came displacement, warfare, and forced removal, as colonial powers, and later the United States government, expanded westward. Treaties were signed and broken. Land that had been home to dozens of generations was seized, and entire nations were forced onto smaller and smaller territories, or removed altogether, most infamously along routes like the Trail of Tears in the 1830s, when thousands of Cherokee, Choctaw, Muskogee, Chickasaw, and Seminole people died during forced relocation to Indian Territory. By the time the borders of the modern United States had taken shape, the world that existed here for 15,000 years had been fundamentally, violently transformed. And this is critical, it was not erased. Despite everything, indigenous nations survived. Languages, ceremonies, governments, and cultures persisted, passed down against extraordinary odds. Today, there are more than 500 federally recognized tribes across the United States, each with its own government, history, and living culture, direct descendants of the very people who were here first.